Hi, I'm Rob King and welcome to the retrospective on our Christmas Turbo Cider Extravaganza. In today's episode we are going to look at the plan, the recipe and our re-evaluation, very nice, of those ciders. We are going to look at the vital statistics, the schedule, the costs and the price per pint, and of course that final ranking. How did they finally stack up against all of the other brews we've done this year? And finally we'll finish with some lessons learned. Our plan then was 1. The Christmas Kiss. This was a pressed apple cider to try and prove the point if pressed apples deliver a stronger apple flavour overall. 2nd was a real Iron Brew 1901 Turbo Cider. This was our Christmas kick. And then finally the Christmas Spice, a mulled cider just in time for Christmas. Now, before we begin, all 3 ciders used exactly the same yeast, the Safe Cider TF6. They also all included some DAP yeast nutrient. This is recommended for this particular style of yeast to be able to add some nitrogen to help the yeast growth. And then finally they all included glycerine. This helps improve the overall viscosity of the final result, but it also raises the sweetness just a little, and I find it a good addition. Now for the Christmas Kiss, it did turn out initially very cloudy, so we added some findings and some pectolase to try and improve that situation. Here's our re-evaluation 6 weeks later. Our Christmas Kiss. Cheers. Despite our early challenges, the clarity has turned out absolutely fine. Carbonation is there, just a little light, but bubbling away nicely. The aroma, very appley. Now that was our test, wasn't it? Would pressed apples have a greater flavour? Aroma is definitely very good. Let's go for the taste. The flavour has remained consistent with our earlier evaluation. It is very nice, it's a little tart, but it does have a nice, probably red apple flavour to it. So the score on this one remains very good indeed. That 1901 Iron Brew was the main event for our Christmas kick, and that had lots and lots of sugar in it, so the ABV came out much higher. Let's see how that worked out. Nice and clear, nice and fizzy. So our Christmas kick aroma does remain actually quite fruity. Definitely cidery. A little less Iron Brewy, but it's still definitely there. Clarity and carbonation is very nice. Mouthfeel is just a little light. It is still quite dry. It has a tartness straight away, full in the mouth. Though actually this year I have come to quite like some of the drier, smoother drinks. This definitely falls into that category, but it does have a nice warming feel as it also goes down. You do lose some of the Iron Brew flavour in the taste, but you do still get it in the aroma. I am inclined to upgrade this drink in retrospective, that actually it is far more drinkable than I first thought. Maybe that is just a little bit of extra time to help smooth it all out. Cheers everyone, one more to go. Finally, we come to the Christmas Spice. Now this one is a mulled cider with lots of spice additions that were all added in secondary. We also increased the ABV of this one slightly by adding brewing sugar at the very beginning. Let's see how this one's re-evaluated. Definitely saving the best for last. Look at this one, lovely and clear, really good, nice carbonation there. Aroma too. It does have a nice dash of apple, but it is all of those spices. Though it is the apple now coming through on the aroma the most. Right off the bat, mouthfeel is absolutely lovely. It has that touch of viscosity that really sort of clings, but it isn't cloying. It's just very delicious. It's very smooth. It doesn't feel like you're drinking an alcoholic drink. It has no warming effect. It is just very nice indeed. For 2026, this one is my winner. Moving on then to some of those vital statistics. Now we only have a few pieces of data here. All 3 recipes were in fact 8-litre recipes, and the Christmas Kiss came in at 6.6%, the Christmas Kick came in at 8.3%, and then finally that mellow Christmas Spice came in at 5.8%. Now that final one was a little higher deliberately because we added some additional brewing sugar, and if you wanted to actually take a few ABV points off that one, you could simply exclude that brewing sugar we added at the very start. All of them dried out to fairly low final gravities, but it was the Christmas Spice that ended up just a little bit higher to add a bit more of that sweetness. It is perhaps in the schedule we see a few more differences. Now in practice, all 3 recipes were about 2 weeks in that primary fermentation phase, but it could have been a little bit less. It was simply down to timing of weekends when there was an opportunity to do some of the activities. But starting with the Christmas Kiss, that was the simplest. 10 days in fermentation, a couple of weeks then in cold crash to help with a little bit of that clarity, and then straight into bottling. We did add a couple of extra days at the very end to include some finings, and that was time well spent. We went from a very cloudy result to something that was near crystal clear. That was a nice result for the pressed apple cider. The Christmas Kick also 2 weeks in fermentation, 2 weeks in cold crash, and then into the bottles. Both of these first 2 recipes I did natural carbonation by including a spunding valve, so that helped move things along a little bit more quickly. Also the spunding valve and the pressure fermentation does help to remove off flavours, so hopefully that was a nice addition for this particular recipe. Though as we'll see in lessons learned, there were some cons to pressure fermentation. Our Christmas Spice then had a different profile because we had to add all of those flavourings and actually wanted to give it an extended period of time in secondary and in cold crash with all of those spices included to mix in and deliver some of those lovely flavours we got at the end. So this was a game of 3 particular phases: fermentation for about 10 days, secondary for another 10 days, and then cold crash for another 10 days. Delivered us the flavours we were looking for, and at that point we were still uncarbonated, so although we had a lovely clear and very tasty drink, we were running out of time. So literally I did force carbonation in a keg to deliver the end result, and I have to say, result achieved. If I'd had more time, I would have used the set and wait method for carbonation, but I was running out of time to bottle these up and distribute them to friends for Christmas, so forced carbonation it was, and successfully achieved. That was the schedule, but how much do they all cost? And it is here we see quite a few differences. Let's start with the simplest of all, the Christmas Kiss. Now this one was a pressed apple cider, so we paid a little bit more for the apple juice on this one, but there were not a lot of additions beyond that, so the final cost for this one was £11.14. The Christmas Kick then was the most expensive, coming in at £27.34. Now I reverted back to a simpler apple juice, so that was cheaper. The real cost came from purchasing a case of the 1901 recipe Iron Brew. This time, rightly and correctly, I purchased the actual 1901 Iron Brew, and full of sugar it was too, but rather delicious. Finally, the Christmas spice came in at half the cost of the Christmas kick. This was £14.29, and of course on this one it was all of those spices that we added in secondary that just nudged up the cost to a little higher than the Christmas kiss. What really does become interesting though is how much does that work out in a price per pint, and of course the Christmas kiss came in cheapest at 97p per pint. That was delicious. In second place, the Christmas spice coming in at £1.25 per pint, and of course that very expensive Iron Brew of course nudged up the cost of that one to £2.18 per pint. This was the winner at £1.25, but I am getting ahead of myself. Where does it all come in the rankings? The winner overall with an all-round near perfect score was of course the Christmas spice. A very close second then was the Christmas kiss, and this again overall was still very good, and particularly in aroma it had a wonderful apple aroma that really came through, but was just a little bit thin in the end result and in terms of the flavour, pushing it down into second place. In third place was the Christmas kick. Now this was quite harsh because in aroma once again this was very good, but in the final mouthfeel it was very thin, and that's where it lost its points. So this became our third place position in terms of being okay, good. Still, overall all three were very drinkable, but how do they stack up against all of the other recipes in 2025? The Christmas spice really came in equal third place, ranking up against the original Iron Brew turbocider and of course that very delicious American cream ale. Similarly, the Christmas kiss came in equal seventh place, stacking up really well against the American cream ale with lime and also another very different type of drink, the Philly sour we did earlier in the year. Finally, the Christmas kick lands in 11th place, but all of the league table this year has been absolutely fantastic and very drinkable. Which brings us neatly onto lessons learned. Lesson number 1, do pressed apples provide more flavour to the final result? And from our experiment I would say the answer to that is yes, it does, without the need to add some apple essence, which is an alternative way of delivering a little bit more apple into the cider. Lesson number 2, and sticking with our Christmas kiss, is the question of whether finings are needed. Well, it is down to personal choice, but if you do want that clarity, finings do successfully deliver a wonderful clear end result. Lesson number 3 then comes down to that natural carbonation and the decision to include a spunding valve to set the pressure to 12 psi throughout the fermentation process. Now there are some pros and cons to this, and so it's worth sort of thinking about that. I do think in hindsight I would have preferred not to do this, but let's start with the pros first of all. Pro number 1 is that it is more efficient on resources using natural carbonation to carbonate the final result, so that was great. Pro number 2 as well is pressure fermentation can help reduce off flavours. Now it's not something I've particularly had a problem with, but again it's useful to try and avoid any of those off flavours if you possibly can. However, this is all offset by 3 cons. Con number 1 is I don't own a floating dip tube, and therefore it wasn't possible to simply transfer off the clear cider, and I had to suck from the bottom, which did bring a little bit of lees through. Con number 2 is also it is a bit more complicated to take a gravity reading once everything is carbonated. Now you can do it, but it takes a little bit of mucking about. Again, that was a con. And then finally, con number 3 then, it's difficult to make adjustments throughout the recipe. Now I do like to test and tweak as we go through a turbo cider, and when I decided to add some erythritol to this recipe, it generated a lot of foaming as I tried to quickly put the cap back on. Lesson number 4 was my new beer gun. I thought this was going to be an easier way to do bottling over my counter pressure bottle filler. In practice, and this is only the first time I've used it, but in practice I did get a lot more foaming than I experienced typically with a counter pressure bottle filler. I think there are pros and cons here, and although it's a bit more of a faff with the counter pressure bottle filler, and I thought the big one would be easier, which it is, it does have some downsides. Lesson number 5, freezing bottles to reduce foaming, was a new lesson. Now oddly enough, I have chilled kegs before for exactly the same reason, but hadn't considered just throwing the bottles into the freezer an hour before bottling, and you've already got nice cold bottles ready to try and reduce some of that foaming. Lesson number 6, and I also tried something else new, surprise surprise, during this recipe, and that was the inclusion of PET bottles. Now these were lighter for transport for a start, so that was my primary reason. They did turn out really well, quite handy, quite cheap actually, but the only downside was having to buy new plastic caps when you use them a second time around, which I'm having trouble sourcing. Lesson number 7 is specific to the Homebrew turbocider, and last time I created a very dark and a little cloudy liquid when I was condensing the Homebrew by adding the tea bags too soon during the simmering process. This time I made sure I added them to the condensed liquid after the simmering had completed, and so steeping those tannins out did result in a much clearer end result. Lesson number 8 is the condensing rate. Now how long does it take to condense those bottles or cans of liquid down to something that's a bit more useful? And what I've discovered is that it takes about 2.5 hours of simmering to reduce the volume by about 78%, and that's been really consistent through all the recipes I've done now. So now I know what I can aim for, and roughly 2.5 hours is probably my target zone. Lesson number 9 relates specifically to the Christmas spiced cider, and specifically to my dosing it with erythritol for back sweetening. I accidentally dosed it twice, having forgotten I'd already done it previously. Now that double dose of erythritol was an error, but a fortuitous one. The end result was fabulous. Well, thank you everybody for listening. Do like and subscribe. Cheers everyone. Happy homebrewing. Good health. Job done.